Somewhere in your city right now, there's an animal considered a beloved family member curled up on someone's couch. In another part of the world, at this exact same moment, a genetically similar animal is being served in a bowl of stew, considered an ordinary, unremarkable meal. Same species, same evolutionary history, same capacity for loyalty, intelligence, and affection. And yet, depending entirely on which country you happen to be standing in, that animal occupies two completely different categories in the human mind: family or food, with almost nothing in between. Why? The honest answer has almost nothing to do with biology and almost everything to do with history, psychology, and where exactly a line got drawn differently in different places at different times. To understand why this question is even complicated, you have to start with an uncomfortable fact. Dogs have never been purely one thing or the other, anywhere, for very long. Genetic evidence suggests dogs and wolves split from a common ancestor somewhere between 11,000 and 40,000 years ago, with most researchers converging on a domestication window closer to 15 to 16,000 years ago, based on secure archaeological and genomic evidence, though some contested remains push the timeline even earlier, long before farming existed, before permanent settlements, before almost anything else we associate with human civilization. Dogs were already living alongside people, and the popular image of early humans gently taming a few friendly wolf pups turns out to be an oversimplification. Genetic research increasingly suggests dogs may have split from the wolf lineage on their own and gravitated toward hunter-gatherer camps, largely under their own initiative, drawn by food scraps and mutual benefit, well before agriculture or deliberate breeding entered the picture. From nearly that same starting point, dogs served multiple overlapping roles at once: hunting partners, guards, companions, and, in many places, food. In what's now Texas, archaeologists have identified a domesticated dog skull fragment dated to roughly 9,400 years ago that shows clear evidence the animal was both bred and eaten, one of the oldest confirmed examples of dogs serving as a food source anywhere in the Americas. In pre-Columbian Mexico, the Aztecs bred a specific type of dog, sometimes called the Tachichi, and closely related to the modern Xoloitzcuintli, explicitly for meat. When the conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan in 1519, he documented small gelded dogs, which they breed for eating, being sold openly in the city's markets, alongside other dogs that served entirely different roles as companions and even as figures in religious mythology. Native American communities varied enormously in how they viewed dog meat, a detail that undercuts any simple story of one ancient tradition at all. Among the Sioux and Cheyenne of the Great Plains, dog meat, so long as it wasn't from a wild dog, was considered an acceptable and sometimes ceremonial food served at important feasts. For the Comanche, by contrast, eating any dog meat at all was considered genuinely repellent, even within a single continent. Among cultures separated by nothing more than a few hundred miles, the exact same animal could be sacred food or an unthinkable taboo. That same split personality followed European settlers into North America. Members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, stranded in unfamiliar territory in the winter of 1805 and 1806, with dwindling food supplies, began purchasing and eating dogs from the Nez Perce, who kept large numbers of them as working animals and companions. Meriwether Lewis wrote candidly that, after getting past their initial cultural discomfort, many members of the party grew extremely fond of dog meat, in Lewis's own words, some even preferring it to elk or venison. And yet, the very same expedition treated Lewis's own Newfoundland dog, Seaman, with what historians describe as more documented affection and respect than most human members of the crew received in the journals. An animal companion, not a meal, traveling the entire journey by his side. Even within one small group of explorers in the exact same season, dogs were simultaneously dinner and family, depending entirely on which specific dog you were talking about. It would be easy to assume this kind of practical, circumstance-driven dog eating was something that only happened far from Western Europe. The historical record says otherwise. During the Siege of Paris, from September 1870 to January 1871, Prussian forces cut the city off from outside supplies for over 4 months. As conventional food ran out, Parisians worked their way through an increasingly desperate menu. Horses went first. An estimated 65 to 70,000 were butchered over the course of the siege, including prize racehorses that had once belonged to the emperor himself. When horse meat grew scarce, cats and dogs became the next practical option, alongside rats and eventually animals from the Paris Zoo. What makes this chapter particularly striking is that it wasn't only the desperate poor who turned to it. With no rationing system in place for much of the siege, wealthier Parisians ate comparatively well, and some of the city's fashionable restaurants and clubs served these same unconventional meats as refined, elegantly presented dishes. The Jockey Club's menu featured rat, prepared as salmi de rats, and rat pie, while dog cutlets appeared on other notable menus of the period, including one served to American minister Elihu Washburn, served alongside more familiar fare. Less an act of desperation than a strange, dark culinary novelty for those who could afford to treat starvation cuisine as an occasion. It's a detail that rarely makes it into popular retellings of French culinary history, but it's well documented in contemporary accounts and diaries from the period. The lesson isn't that the French have some hidden dog-eating tradition. It's the opposite, and more interesting. Given the right circumstances, sustained hunger, collapsed supply chains, no functioning alternative, the cultural taboo against eating dogs turns out to be remarkably situational everywhere, including in exactly the cultures that consider themselves furthest removed from the practice today. The barrier was never absolute, it was conditional, and it bent the moment survival demanded it, in Paris just as readily as anywhere else in the world. In 2021, researchers at Purdue University's Center for Animal Welfare Science published a peer-reviewed study documenting something unexpected: pigs playing video games. They rigged a joystick to a screen and trained pigs to control an on-screen cursor using their snouts, aiming it at moving targets for a food reward. The pigs learned it, tracking targets on the screen with an accuracy that surprised even the researchers running the experiment, a level of abstract problem-solving that had, until then, mostly been demonstrated in primates and dogs. It's the kind of detail that makes the whole question harder to dodge. If the capacity for learning, memory, and genuine cognitive complexity isn't actually the dividing line between the animal curled up on your couch and the animal on your plate, then what is? Part of the answer lies in something researchers studying human-animal attachment describe in terms of shifting economic and social roles. As Western societies industrialized and urbanized, dogs' practical working functions, herding, guarding, hunting, pulling loads, became less essential to daily survival for most ordinary households. At the same time, dogs increasingly moved indoors, into close daily proximity with families, sharing living space in a way farm animals and livestock generally didn't. That physical closeness mattered enormously. Animals kept at a functional distance, in a barn, a pen, a coop, tend to stay categorized as livestock in most people's minds. Animals sleeping in the same room as your children tend not to. There's also a psychological mechanism worth naming directly. Humans have a well-documented tendency to respond with heightened affection and protective instinct toward features associated with juvenile animals: large eyes, a rounded face, soft or expressive features, a phenomenon closely tied to what researchers call the cute response, first described by ethologist Konrad Lorenz in the context of human infants, but shown to extend powerfully to animals that share similar physical traits. Dogs, through thousands of years of selective breeding, increasingly emphasized exactly these features in many popular breeds, and dogs also developed a genuinely unusual capacity, more refined than almost any other domesticated animal, for reading human facial expressions, following human gaze, and responding to human emotional cues in real time. That combination, appearance and behavior working together, made dogs unusually effective at triggering the same emotional and protective circuitry humans use for their own children and for each other. Circuitry that a pig, however cognitively capable, was simply never bred to trigger in the same way. Social psychologist Melanie Joy has given this entire pattern a name: carnism, the largely invisible belief system that leads people to eat certain animals without a second thought, while recoiling at the idea of eating others, not based on any consistent underlying principle, but based on arbitrary cultural categorization, absorbed so early and so completely that it rarely feels like a choice at all. Her own framing of the idea, in the title of her most widely read book, is blunt: Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. That pig with the joystick was never lacking the intelligence to earn a different category. It was simply never in the room. Put simply, dogs didn't earn their exemption from the dinner table through biology. What they earned over thousands of years of close, daily, emotionally reciprocal contact with humans, specifically inside the home, was reclassification. Somewhere along the way, in specific cultures, dogs stopped being read primarily as animal and started being read as something closer to kin. Here's the part of the story that gets much more complicated once you actually look at it globally. and it's worth being genuinely even-handed about, rather than treating one culture's answer as simply correct and another's as simply wrong. In several countries, dog meat remains a real, if increasingly contested, part of food culture today. In Vietnam, it's traditionally associated with social gatherings and specific seasonal celebrations. In parts of China, dog meat retains a place in regional cuisine, though the country has no nationwide ban and has, at the same time, officially classified dogs as companion animals in some contexts, reflecting the same dual identity playing out at a national policy level. In the Philippines, dog meat appears in specific ritual practices among some communities. In Switzerland, a small number of rural households entirely legally continue a long-standing regional tradition of consuming dog meat, a detail that surprises most Westerners who assume this is exclusively an Asian or historically distant practice. In parts of Nigeria and Togo, dog meat is associated with particular ceremonies, believed by some to confer strength, and continues to serve as an accessible protein source in communities facing genuine economic hardship. South Korea has become the most closely watched case study of this whole debate, largely because the country's relationship with dog meat has been shifting in real time, in full public view, over the last several years. Dog meat, traditionally served in a stew called boshintang, has deep historical roots in Korean cuisine, and as recently as a few years ago, surveys estimated South Koreans were still consuming roughly 2 million dogs annually, but that number has fallen sharply and rapidly. Explosive growth in pet ownership, generational change, sustained activism from animal welfare organizations, and a documented shift in public sentiment. One 2020 survey found that over 80% of South Koreans said they had never eaten dog meat or had no intention of doing so in the future, combined to build unprecedented political momentum. On January 9, 2024, South Korea's National Assembly passed a landmark law by a unanimous 208-0 vote, banning the breeding, slaughtering, and sale of dogs for meat, with the ban set to fully take effect by 2027 after a phase-out period offering compensation to farmers transitioning out of the industry. Notably and tellingly, the law stops short of criminalizing the act of eating dog meat itself, focusing entirely on the supply chain, a legislative choice that reflects the country's own internal, ongoing negotiation between tradition and rapidly shifting cultural sentiment, rather than an externally imposed judgment. It's worth being honest about a genuine critique that scholars studying this topic have raised directly, because it complicates any simple narrative where one culture's food taboo is treated as more civilized than another's. Yale historian Paul Friedman, a food historian who has studied this exact stereotype in detail, has pointed out that the underlying objection isn't really rooted in animal welfare science or nutritional logic at all. As he told the Associated Press, treating dog consumption as, in his words, not just a matter of taste, but a violation of what it is to be human, while treating the industrial-scale slaughter of pigs and cows as unremarkable, reflects a cultural and historical double standard more than a coherent, consistently applied ethical principle. Researchers studying animal cognition broadly support that same underlying point on a factual level. The line separating food animal from companion animal tracks cultural history and emotional familiarity far more closely than it tracks any measurable difference in the animal's intelligence or capacity to suffer. There's a genuinely troubling historical dimension layered on top of that inconsistency as well, one that's important to state plainly. The specific stereotype of Asian immigrants as dog eaters has a documented history rooted not in observed behavior, but in racial prejudice. As Asian immigrants began arriving in the United States in significant numbers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they encountered widespread hostility, and Asian cuisines were frequently stereotyped by a hostile public as exotic, barbaric, and threatening, regardless of what those communities were actually eating. Friedman has drawn a direct line from that history to modern events, noting that the same rhetorical pattern resurfaced as recently as 2024 when false claims about Haitian immigrants eating pets in an Ohio town spread rapidly through national politics and media, despite having no basis in fact, echoing more than a century of the same accusation being leveled at whichever immigrant community happened to be least understood at the time. That trope has persisted, sometimes in the form of casual jokes, long after its original context, even though survey data consistently shows the overwhelming majority of Asian Americans have no connection to dog meat consumption whatsoever. And even within countries where the practice does have real historical roots, like South Korea, large large and rapidly growing majorities actively oppose it. None of that erases the fact that reasonable people and entire reasonable societies can and do land in genuinely different places on this question, based on their own history, their own relationship with dogs specifically, and their own evolving standards around animal welfare. It simply means the specific shape of the taboo in the West. Why dogs and not pigs? Why this animal and not that one? Owes at least as much to accidents of cultural history and unconscious bias as it does to any careful, consistent ethical reasoning applied evenly across every animal humans eat. What this actually reveals, step back from all of it, and the honest picture that emerges isn't a simple story about right and wrong. It's a story about categorization and how fragile, historically contingent, and culturally specific that categorization really is. Dogs were never biologically exempt from being food. They were among the very first animals humans domesticated, and for most of that 15,000-year-plus relationship, in most of the world, they occupied both roles: worker, companion, and, when circumstances called for it, meal, sometimes within the very same household, sometimes even within the very same expedition, as Lewis and Clark's own journals make clear, and sometimes, as Paris proved in the brutal winter of 1870, on the very same fashionable dinner tables that would have found the idea unthinkable only months before. What changed in specific places at specific historical moments wasn't the animal. It was the emotional and economic role that animal came to occupy in daily human life, close enough, expressive enough, and bonded enough with individual humans to get quietly reclassified out of the category of food altogether, while pigs, chickens, and cows, kept at a physical and emotional distance in barns and pens, never received the same reclassification, despite, by many scientific measures, being every bit as capable of complex thought and real suffering. That's not a comfortable conclusion for anyone looking for a clean, universal answer, but it might be the most honest one available. The line between family member and food was never drawn by biology. It was drawn by proximity, by history, by which animals happened to end up sleeping in the same room as us, generation after generation, until the emotional bond became too strong to eat through in some places, while in others, the exact same animal, with the exact same capacity for loyalty and affection, still quietly feeds a family the way it has, on and off, for most of the 15,000 years humans and dogs have spent together.